sell us into slavery. So Joseph becomes a slave. You all know the story. He's in Potiphar's house, and then he gets getting falsely accused, and he goes to prison, and then he interprets dreams, and then he's forgotten about, and then he sits in prison, and then Pharaoh has a dream, and then all of a sudden he goes from the pit all the way to Potiphar's house, all the way to Pharaoh's house. And we all know the story of Joseph. His brothers come to him during the famine, hat in hand, if you will. They don't recognize him because he's all painted up like an Egyptian. They ask for some supplies. Joseph could take out vengeance on his brothers. I would have. I'm not going to lie if my brothers did that to me. But Joseph shows the mercy. And because there is a famine in the land, Israel and all of his sons come into Egypt. Remember that? Now, I noticed something, and I started thinking about something as we get into Exodus chapter 1. That was never supposed to be a permanent solution. Did you know that? Whenever Israel and his sons came into Egypt, they were not supposed to stay there. If you remember, what did they promise great-grandpa Abraham? God told Abraham, he said, everywhere the sole of your foot touches, that's yours. That's Canaan. That's your land. And then Isaac begat Jacob, and then we go just a few generations down the road, and then we see the 12 sons of Israel, and that becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. And where are they supposed to be? Egypt. No, they're supposed to be in Canaan. The pit stop at Egypt was a temporary solution for a temporary problem. But if you look in Exodus 1, I'm going to show you something that God showed me that just really blew my mind and made me start to think about this whole story of the children of Israel and Egypt completely different. Look with me in Exodus 1, verse 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the lands of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. So 70 Jews showed up in Egypt, and they all died there. But look with me in verse 7. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. This evening, we're going to look at, over the next little bit, with God's help, the problem with complacency. The problem with complacency. God did not want the children of Israel in Egypt long term. That was a temporary solution to a temporary problem. The long-term goal was to go to Egypt. God had set Joseph up there in Egypt as second in command to Pharaoh. He was the vice president of Egypt. And that's why God put Joseph in that pit, and the Potiphar's house, and then Pharaoh's house, all in preparation to bring the children of Israel, all to bring those 12, what would become the 12 tribes in, these 70 Jewish men and women, to bring them into Egypt and to live out and get through the famine. And then they were not supposed to stay there. Never were they supposed to stay in Egypt as long as they did. They were supposed to go to Canaan. That's where God told them to be. But what happens? Why did all of this happen? Why did the Exodus have to happen? Why did Moses have to rise up? Why did they have to part the Red Sea? Why did they have to wander in the desert for 40 years? Why? Because they were in God's permissive will, because they became complacent in Egypt. It was a temporary spot they were supposed to be. But if you look with me right here, what's it say? And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. They became comfortable and complacent in Egypt. Can I say, Christians, there is a real problem with complacency as a Christian. there is a real problem that we can have in our Christian walk and in our Christian life if we become complacent with where we're at. It might be where God wants us for that season of life, but then God wants us to move on and go on to where He wants us, and we become complacent. And we're like, well, I'm just going to stay right here. I feel great right where I'm at. You see it time and time again in pastors, and it's so sad. Pastors will take a church, and they'll stay at that church, and that church will thrive and build up, and God will bless it. They'll be there 20 years, 30 years sometimes, and God will bless it in a great and mighty way. But then God will start to tug on their hearts and tell them, okay, it's time to go somewhere else. I want you to go somewhere else. Your season here is done. And what do? They stay right where they're not supposed to be. They become complacent because they're comfortable there, because they don't want to leave there. Let's look at the problem with complacency we find here in Exodus chapter 1. First off, comfort leads to complacency. We just talked about that in verse 7. They were fruitful and increased abundantly, and they multiplied and waxed exceeding and mighty, and the land was filled with them. The children of Israel were comfortable. They forgot they weren't supposed to stay in Egypt, and that temporary fix became a permanent solution. Now, in your Christian walk, in your daily walk with God, what will happen is this. You'll get real comfortable wherever you're at. You'll get real comfortable there, and that comfort will lead to your complacency. Because then God may call you to do something else. You may have been, okay, I've been doing this. I've been teaching this Sunday school class for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and I've been doing this every day, and then God lays on your heart, okay, I want you to go down to the women's prison and start a ministry down there, and you say, well, I can't do that. This is where you want me, God, and we become complacent because we're so comfortable in that position, but maybe God wants us to move to something different. Maybe God wants us to expand in a certain way, but that comfort level, that causes complacency. And so we see that. That's the first problem with complacency. Your comfort level will sometimes lead you to be complacent. But then I want you to see the next step in the problem with complacency. Complacency leads to conflict. So comfort leads to your complacency and your complacent attitude towards the things of God and the things that God wants you to do. And that complacency leads to conflict. Look with me in verse 8 through 10. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he was unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so we get them up out of the land. So you see how that complacency led to conflict, because what happened? A new king arose. That's what we see in verse 8. How does the Bible put it? And I've heard people preach about this so often. And now there arose up a new king over Egypt, what? Which knew not Joseph. Can I tell you something? The children of Israel never should have been there so long that a Pharaoh ever came up that didn't know Joseph. How many generations were they removed that the Pharaoh didn't know the vice Pharaoh from 3 seasons ago? How far away from this time whenever Joseph was the man? He was the guy that saved Egypt. He was the one that had the dreams. He was the one that interpreted the dream that got him through the drought, that killed everybody else but the Egyptians. He was the one that brought these Jewish people in. And now we're so far removed from that a new king rises up and he doesn't even know who Joseph is. He's like, Joseph? Who's Joseph? I don't care about Joseph. I don't care about this guy you're talking about. I never knew him. I never met him. You see, when you're complacent, it leads to conflict, because what happens with your complacency, something new will come along and it will shift the whole dichotomy of the situation you're in. It will shift everything. And when this new Pharaoh rose up that didn't know Joseph, there was a huge shift. So the new king brought on a new realization in verse 9. And he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. The Pharaoh of Egypt, one of the greatest nations in that time, he looked around and he said, hang on a second. These Jewish folks could whip us if they had a mind to. There's a whole lot more of those Jews than there are of Egyptians. And so it changes and it gives them that realization, which gives them a new mindset. Look with me in verse 10. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out of any war, they join also our enemies and fight against us. And so get them up out of the land. So that new realization leads to the mindset, we're going to have to do something about these guys. You want me to tell you something? You want to know why this happened? Do you want to know why? And this is the revelation that came to me. I'm not one of these guys that has a new word from the Lord. I'm just somebody that reads something and I see, oh, God is telling me something here. And you know what? God let me realize that I never thought of before. You know why all this happened? Because God wanted it to. Because the Jews were where they shouldn't be, and God said, I'm going to get them out. And they ain't going to like it. Can I tell you something? If you get complacent and you're not where God wants you to be, God will get you out. And you ain't going to like it. This is chastisement of the children of Israel. This is God whipping the children of Israel. We always get down on the Egyptians. These Egyptians are so evil. These Egyptians, they wanted to kill all the male children that were born to the Jewish people. That Pharaoh hardened his heart. They were such an evil people. Why do you think it says later in Exodus that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh? Do you ever think about that? It's because God was using Pharaoh to punish the children of Israel for their complacency and their sin. We got to be careful with complacency, Christians, because we get real comfortable with where we're not supposed to be. I'm not talking about in our Christian walk. I'm talking about real comfortable being in Egypt. Egypt represents the world. Egypt represents sin. Egypt represents where Christians should not want to be, just like the children of Israel should not have wanted to be there. We should want to dwell in Canaan land, which is a type and a picture of the Christian being in the dead center of God's will and doing what God wants them to do. That's what that pictures. But what happens, we get real complacent in Egypt. And when we get complacent in sin, we get complacent outside of where God wants us to be, that's going to lead to conflict. And then I see that the conflict leads to captivity. Look with me in verse 11. It says this, therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage and mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. So you see that complacency led to conflict, and the conflict led to what? Captivity. What happens with Christians when they become complacent in Egypt? They become captive in Egypt. They become slaves to the world that they are supposed to be out of. They become slaves in the place that they're supposed to not want to be in, because we become complacent with our sin. We become complacent with our livelihood. We become complacent with being somewhere. We're comfortable there. We become complacent there. And then that leads to conflict. And then that conflict leads us to our ultimate captivity. First, I see there are taskmasters. Look with me in verse 11. Therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasured cities. Do you see what happens whenever you become captive to the world, Christian? The world becomes your taskmaster, and the world begins to make you do things for the world instead of serving God. Where should the children of Israel have been at this point? They should have been in Canaan land. They should have been driving out the inhabitants of Canaan. They could have skipped ahead hundreds of years in their history and their development in Israel had they just not been complacent in Egypt. Had they not just got comfortable there and they just settled in there. But then they became slaves there, and the taskmasters were set over them, and the taskmasters then afflicted them. So what does that conflict that leads to captivity? You see taskmasters, and you see affliction, and you see hard work, and you see bitter, bitter lives. That is the problem with complacency of a Christian. May we not be complacent. Don't let us get comfortable in the world. Don't let us do what the Jewish people did. You see, when they went in, there were 12 men and their families, 70. There were 70 people there. 70 Jewish people in Egypt. And by the time they left, they numbered near 1 million. So the complacency of the children of Israel, those 12 men that became comfortable there and stayed there, it affected generations to come. See, that's why we don't want to become complacent as Christians. Because the decisions we make here not only affect us, but that pushes into generations ahead of us. If we become complacent and we become comfortable with any one thing, say we become complacent and comfortable. Here's the problem when we're talking about complacency. You can become complacent and comfortable with things like, oh, well, this is just the people that are here. You know, whenever people become complacent with not seeing souls saved, you know what happens? You start to hear this phrase. You want to know the phrase? You want to know a phrase that Pastor David hates? You ready? Family church. I hate that phrase. You go out, and I've gone to preach at churches before, they're like, oh, this is just old country church, this little family church. I thought it was God's church. I was under the impression that God owned the church. I didn't know the Smiths owned the church. But that's what people will say. They'll say, oh, it's just a small family church. That's because of complacency with not going out and seeing folks saved and brought in. And that's where that phrase comes from. We throw it around a lot in Appalachia. And I never really thought about it one day until I was getting ready to preach behind the pulpit of a family church. And I was preaching on the church of the living God. And I thought, wait a second. This church don't belong to the Joneses. This church is God's. But we've become so complacent that the only people that's going to come in are the people that we're related to. And that's a scary place. That's a dangerous, complacent place to be as a church. When you have that mindset of nobody comes here but our people, our family, you know, that's scary. I thank God that at Faith Gospel Church we've got Grigsby's and we've got Harper's and we've got Joneses and we've got Bates. We got all different kinds. You know, you don't come in and you're like, oh, everybody here is a Smith. Everybody here is a Stephen. You know? We reach out. When people come from Arizona, we didn't say, oh, blah, 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 blah. You ain't from around here. You ain't our people. We didn't do that. But you know, there are some churches that become complacent, and that's what they do. People come in from another community, like, oh, I'm going to go visit that church. And they're like, I'm never going back there. Why? I felt so unwelcome. Because everybody, when I came in, instead of hugging me or shaking my hand, saying, we're so glad to see you here, they're so complacent. And they're like, they do this. This is the way you see it. Better not sit in Jenny's pew. Jenny smacked her head off. He's sitting her. Let me tell you something. You know what ticked me to death one day? Everybody just come in and just be in a different pew. I love that. I won't know where anybody's at. I won't be able to pick on Margaret. I'll be so confused. But that's what complacency breeds. That thought of, this church isn't going to grow. This church isn't going to thrive. We're just going to be, God bless me, my wife, my son, his wife, us four, no more. See, that's the problem with complacency in the church and church growth. And then there's also problems with complacency in church in your service to God. Maybe, like I said earlier, you get real comfortable doing one certain thing. And that's the only certain thing you ever do. And that's fine if that's where God wants you. But maybe when you're praying and you say, God, show me your will in my life. And you think, okay, God's will in my life is for me to clean the carpet in church. I've done that for 20 years. And then God whispers in your ear, go out and do this. And you're like, oh, God, you're mistaken. I'm the carpet cleaner. That's complacency. It's uncomfortable. Remember, Miss Janelle wasn't real comfortable when I said, will you teach the ladies Sunday school class? She said, I'd love to do it. She prayed about it, and that's where God has her. And what a blessing. What would have happened had she been complacent in her service? I'm like, I don't do that. I don't do that. What a blessing our women would have missed on Sunday morning. I remember asking other people to do other things when I first came because I was ignorant. I didn't know what people did, so I would kind of ask, okay, who does this? And they would be like, oh, such and such. You said, oh, great, where are they? Well, they passed away. Or they're too sick to come to church anymore. Well, there's a hole there. And so I was forced as a new young pastor to go and say, hey, would you be willing to do this? And I was so pleased that there wasn't complacency when people would say, yeah, I'll do that. I'll try that for a little bit. You tell a pastor that, it's your job then. I'll try that for a little bit. Yes. 3 years later, have you found anybody else? No, I'm still looking. But you see, that's what shows me that members of our church aren't complacent, because they do go outside their comfort zone. They do go places and do things because they feel God leading them into it. But God, help us not to become complacent and be shut off to the fact that God might want us to do more, that God might have more in store for us, because then we will become captives in our service. But then not only that complacency and that mindset of church and that ministry in church, but also, we talked about it at length already, but that mindset towards the world, where we become complacent with allowing sin in our lives. We become complacent. We allow sin in our homes. We allow sin in our church. We allow sin wherever. And that complacency, that will lead to huge conflict. It's so sad sometimes you see and you hear about it and they say, this church had a business meeting and they split over the color of the carpet, and that's like an urban legend. That really happens. That really truly happens. I mean, that's we hear that from the pulpit and we're like, that's like an evangelist story. Like that happens. That really happens. Churches split over those things. But you want me to let you in a little secret? When the churches split over those things, it has absolutely nothing to do with the color of the carpet. Nothing. It has nothing to do with the color of the walls or the curtains or whatever crazy thing they split over. It has nothing to do with that. You want to know what it has to do with? Complacency. They become complacent in their ministry and their mindset of service, and then they become complacent in their mindset towards sin, and all of those things make them captive, and then it's just a straw that breaks the camel's back. It's not the carpet that splits churches, honey. It's complacency. That's the truth. We're going to do this because this is the way we've always done it. That's It's complacency. When we become so in tune with the way that I want to do things. I was talking to someone not too long ago about how we're blessed with deacons and they're not yes men. I said, I don't want men that would just agree with everything I say. If I say something dumb, I want them to say, that's dumb. Because we're not here to serve Pastor David. We're not here to serve the deacon. We're here to serve God as the family of God. And how that best looks. How does that look? How can we do that best? But when churches and pastors, we all become complacent and then we stop asking ourselves, how can we serve the Lord best? And we say, how can we do it the way we always have done it? And that's a complacent church. So that is the three problems I see here in Exodus chapter 1 with complacency. The road out of complacency is a hard one. It's a hard road. Remember, we just reviewed how you get there, but if you remember, that's just the first part of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 1 and verse 15, we see the king of Egypt talking to these two Hebrew midwives, and he says, whenever you're a midwife to the Hebrew women, and you sit on the stools, and if it's a son, you kill the man-child. You kill him. Because we don't want a bunch of strong male Jewish men around here to raise an army up against us. You kill the boys. That's really where the story of Exodus begins. We kind of skip over that introductory portion. We don't see that all the complacency leads to everything that comes after in Exodus. Everything. Everything that comes after in Exodus is because of the complacency in the first 15 verses. Everything. The fact that God had to raise up a man named Moses. The fact that God had to take Moses and put him in a basket and put him down the river. And God had to put him in Pharaoh's house to be raised up for 40 years. All those things that happened to Moses, all because of the children of Israel's complacency. All of it. And then the children, the people in Egypt had to suffer enormous amounts of suffering, all the way up to the death of all the firstborn children. Why? Because of the complacency of the children of Israel. The Egyptians also suffered. Puts a whole new spin on the whole Exodus tale when you realize that the whole reason it happened is because they became complacent with where they were. God doesn't want us in Egypt, church. He doesn't want us there. God wants us in Canaan land, serving him, where milk and honey flows. He wants us right in the dead center of his will for our lives individually, in the dead center of his will for this church as a group. That's where God wants us. He wants us in Canaan. But let's not get complacent in Egypt. Because if we do, it's a long, hard road out of there sometimes. We've seen thousands of churches close in the past few years. Thousands, tens of thousands. I'm not talking about worldwide. I'm talking right here in the good old U.S. of A. Why? Well, COVID killed them. No, COVID didn't kill them. They were complacent before COVID ever happened. So then it became a very convenient excuse in their complacency to shut the doors. That's the problem with being complacent. Let us never be complacent. May we always push forward in the perfect will of God together. That way, we can dwell in Canaan land. That way, people can look and we can be a city set on a hill. We can be a light shining in the community and not just a bunch of complacent people setting in Egypt. Every head bowed and every eye closed.